Congresswoman and former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi is 82 years old. Regardless of what you might think about her politics, you have to admit if you've seen her in action that she's in remarkably good shape for someone her age. So what's her secret? Could it be her diet? Well, it turns out that she eats the same thing for lunch every day, a hot dog with mustard and relish. And she's also admitted to sometimes having chocolate ice cream for breakfast. As she told a reporter about her morning routine, "It's right there. It has a long shelf life and it's a great way to start the day." You might think I'd be pretty horrified by this, given that I'm a nutritionist, but I actually drink a mini Coke for breakfast myself every morning. And while I don't typically have hot dogs for lunch, it's not completely unheard of for me to stop at McDonald's for a quarter pounder and a small fry. Now I can hear you thinking, what about all the research that says processed foods are bad for us? And yes, there is a lot of it. Just start typing processed foods and into Google and watch it autofill. So how can eating hot dogs every day possibly be okay? To answer that, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about nutrition research more generally. That's because it'll help us better understand what we know now, and just as important, don't know now, and maybe even more important, may never know about the relationship between diet and health. Of course, every animal species understands at some level that food is essential for survival, but we humans have the additional ability to ask and try to answer why that's so. In the 1700s, carbohydrates, fat, and protein were shown to be sources of energy, or calories, by Lavoisier, and in the 1800s, protein was shown to be necessary for tissue growth and repair by von Liebig. But meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of sailors, some have even said millions, were dying of scurvy as explorers and navies sailed their way around the world. Scurvy, as you may know, turned out to be caused by a lack of vitamin C, found primarily in fruits and vegetables that were not as easily carried on board ships as compared to dried meats and grain products. But scurvy was just one of several deficiency diseases that were causing epidemics of death and disease all over the globe. Others included beriberi and pellagra. You likely have never heard of these, and that's because, unlike the health problems in the US today, like heart disease, cancer, and diabetes, by the early 1900s, we'd figured out their exact causes and therefore how to both prevent and cure them. But it wasn't easy. The biggest problem facing nutrition scientists back then was one of perspective. Keep in mind that by the late 1800s, the work of Pasteur and others had made clear that most of the epidemics that were killing people by the thousands, like cholera, were caused by microorganisms, ultimately identified as bacteria and viruses that were being passed to and between people, for example, via contaminated water or coughing. That is, they were caused by the presence of something undesirable. But the epidemics of scurvy, beriberi, and pellagra were caused by the absence of something that was actually desirable, an essential nutrient that, it turned out, could only come from food: vitamin C to prevent scurvy, thiamine for beriberi, and niacin for pellagra. It took a while for people to realize that the proverbial needle in the haystack they were searching for as the cause of these diseases wasn't even there. We don't have time to talk in detail here about how each vitamin was ultimately discovered, but it took an amazing combination of luck, limited restrictions on experimenting with humans, which is a whole other story, but reflected by this glowing newspaper account of intentionally producing pellagra in prisoners, and perseverance. To learn more about it, I encourage you to read this wonderful book called Vitamania by Catherine Price, or meet me for a cup of coffee, and I'm happy to tell you more. For our purposes here, however, what was especially important to the ultimate discovery of vitamins is that just as with cholera, there was only one specific cause of each deficiency disease. That is, each was a direct cause and effect relationship. So let's go back to Nancy Pelosi and her hot dogs, or me and my Cokes and quarter pounders. What makes asking whether these foods are going to kill us different? Let's start by considering the following. If you were to stop consuming vitamin C, I can guarantee you with 100% certainty that within a few months you would begin to develop symptoms of scurvy. That's because vitamin C is essential for all humans, regardless of one's genetic makeup or lifestyle characteristics. That is, it doesn't matter if or how much you exercise, whether you smoke, if you eat a lot of fat, drink plenty of water, etc. And 23andMe will never have an entry for scurvy risk based on your DNA analysis. But that's not the case with so-called chronic diseases like heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. They don't have just one cause, dietary or otherwise. They have instead what are called risk factors. That is, characteristics including diet, but also exercise, smoking, stress, and other lifestyle characteristics, along with genetic predisposition, that can increase or decrease one's likelihood of developing a particular problem. and they often track together. That is, people who eat a lot of hot dogs might also not exercise or get enough sleep. That makes these diseases even harder to study because researchers have to account for all of those factors as well. Plus, most of these disorders take a long time to develop, and unlike deficiency diseases, not everyone will develop them. So in the end, researchers are usually limited to what are called observational studies rather than the direct experimentation used with deficiency diseases. That is, they look at or observe the diets of a large group of people and ask whether those who eat more or less of certain foods, like hot dogs or Cokes, or who eat specific categories of foods, like those that are highly processed, are more or less likely to develop the diseases of interest. While that might sound pretty straightforward, here are just a few of the things that make this difficult. First, think about what you typically eat over the course of, say, a week. Now imagine having to write it all down and with enough specificity so that someone could get a fairly accurate assessment of the food's content. Did you go to Smoothie King? What and how much of the potential ingredients did they put in? A burrito bowl for lunch? What was in it and how much? All of the literally hundreds of thousands of food options available to us have to be evaluated accurately. Or they might ask you how frequently you typically eat certain foods or types of foods, which can also be hard to answer. Not only that, all of the other potential risk factors, exercise, alcohol, sleep, stress, etc., have to be measured accurately as well. Otherwise, as a data scientist would say, garbage in, garbage out. Second, unfortunately, research has shown that Americans tend to lie about what they eat or eat differently when they have to record their diets. Why? Because we have a lot of guilt around eating, so we try to make ourselves look better by either intentionally failing to write down that Snickers bar we had for breakfast or deciding not to eat it in the first place. This is the result of our culture's unique history of experience with dietary recommendations dating as far back as the 1800s. Third, we have to talk just a bit about statistics because these studies always report their findings in terms of odds or the risk of developing a disease in association with diet. Let's take a quick look at an example using our processed foods question. A recent study that got a lot of publicity reported a 72% increased risk for cancer in one portion of the large intestine or colon for men who eat a lot of highly processed foods. Here are the actual data. The 5 sets of numbers that go across the top are the number of cases in 5 levels of processed food intake, from the lowest on the left, 62 cases, to the highest on the right, 100 cases. What do you notice about this entire sequence of values? While the number of cases does go up a bit across the first 4 levels, you don't see a really big jump until you get to that highest intake. In fact, the risks reported by most observational studies typically only reflect that difference between lowest and highest levels of consumption for whatever dietary component is being evaluated. Why does that matter? Well, most people, including me and even Nancy Pelosi, are not likely to be in a truly extreme dietary category, making the interpretation of many studies' findings difficult on an individual level. Finally, I think it's important to return to the problem of perspective that plagued the early nutrition scientists. Studies like the one I just described leave the impression that it's the foods being eaten that are doing the harm, maybe because of the extra sugars or sodium or other compounds used in processing. But what if, once again, it's the absence of something beneficial, or maybe several things, perhaps even several things acting together? Will we ever know? Can we ever know, given how difficult it is to do this kind of research? Maybe you'll help to come up with new ways to answer questions about diet and health that don't depend on humans telling the truth about themselves. But for now, it's important to understand that nutrition knowledge has its limitations. So enjoy a Coke or maybe even some ice cream for breakfast if you want to every now and then. Just keep in mind that all things in moderation and variety in all things is often the best conclusion that nutrition research has to offer.